Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting tragedies in Carolina maritime history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will move you in a way few other accounts can. A tale where isolation, duty, and madness collided on a storm-battered lighthouse that stood as both sanctuary and prison. We're about to delve into a mystery that shocked coastal communities for generations, where a respected lighthouse keeper defied all moral boundaries and left a legacy so disturbing that many families still refuse to speak his name. It was the year 1908. Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House. The first Model T rolled off Henry Ford's assembly line, and America was racing toward modernity. But on the Carolina coast, in a lighthouse perched on jagged rocks where the Atlantic hurled itself against the shore with primal fury, time moved differently. There, the modern world seemed like a distant dream, and ancient fears still held dominion over the human heart. The Carolina coast has always been a place of contradictions, beautiful and brutal, serene and savage. For centuries, these barrier islands and treacherous shoals earned the nickname Graveyard of the Atlantic, where hundreds of ships met their end against submerged sandbars and hurricane winds. Lighthouses punctuated this deadly coastline like sentinels, their rotating beams cutting through fog and darkness, warning mariners away from the rocks that lay in wait beneath the waves. Among these guardians stood the Cormorant Point Lighthouse, erected in 1873 on a rocky promontory that jutted into the ocean like an accusing finger. The structure rose 120 feet into the salt air, its black and white spiral pattern visible for miles in daylight, its Fresnel lens powerful enough to project a beam that sailors claimed they could see from 20 nautical miles away on clear nights. It was an isolated posting. The lighthouse sat on an outcrop, accessible only by a narrow causeway that disappeared beneath the tide twice daily, cutting the keeper and his family off from the mainland for hours at a stretch. During storm season, when nor'easters and hurricanes churned the Atlantic into a frothing nightmare, the lighthouse could remain inaccessible for days, even weeks. Supplies came by boat when weather permitted. The nearest town, Marsh Haven, lay 4 miles south, a collection of weathered buildings where fishermen and their families eked out livings from the unforgiving sea. This was not a place for the faint of heart. Lighthouse keeping demanded a particular breed of person, disciplined, self-sufficient, capable of enduring crushing loneliness. The keeper maintained the light mechanism, polished the lens, monitored fuel levels, kept meticulous logs, and performed endless maintenance on a structure constantly assaulted by salt spray and wind. It was monotonous, exhausting work that wore down even the strongest men. But for Thomas Greer, the position seemed perfect. Thomas Greer arrived at Cormorant Point in January of 1905 with impeccable credentials. Born in Massachusetts in 1872, he'd served in the Revenue Cutter Service, precursor to the Coast Guard, for 12 years before transitioning to the Lighthouse Service. His record showed exemplary performance, commendations for bravery during a rescue operation in Maine, stellar evaluations from superior officers, not a single disciplinary mark. He was 33 years old when he took the posting, a tall man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, his face weathered from years spent on deck in Atlantic gales. Photographs from that period show a stern-looking individual with deep, set eyes and a thick mustache, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze direct and unflinching. He looked like what he was, a man accustomed to authority, to order, to the rigid discipline of maritime service. With Thomas came his family. His wife, Eleanor, was 30 years old, a slender woman with delicate features and dark hair that she wore pinned up in the fashion of the era. She'd been a schoolteacher before marriage, educated and refined, the daughter of a Boston merchant. By all accounts, she was devoted to her husband, though friends later recalled that she'd expressed reservations about the lighthouse posting, worried about the isolation, the distance from society and civilization. They had 3 children. Margaret, age 9, was their eldest, a bright girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious demeanor. According to her school records from Boston, she excelled in reading and arithmetic, showed promise as a pianist. Young Thomas, called Tommy, was 6, an energetic boy who loved the ocean, who could spend hours collecting shells and watching the waves. And baby Clara, just 18 months old, still learning to walk, still babbling her first words, a family of 5, settling into a lighthouse at the edge of the world. The first 3 years passed without incident. Thomas Greer proved himself an exceptional keeper. His logs were models of precision, recording weather conditions, passing vessels, fuel consumption, maintenance activities with obsessive detail. Coast Guard inspectors who visited twice annually consistently rated the Cormorant Point station as exemplary. The lens gleamed, the machinery operated flawlessly, the grounds remained immaculate. Eleanor adapted to lighthouse life as best she could. She homeschooled Margaret and Tommy, maintained a small garden in the sheltered lee of the keeper's cottage, wrote long letters to family back in Boston that spoke of the beauty of sunrises over the Atlantic, of dolphins playing in the surf, of her children growing brown and healthy in the sea air. Yet between the lines, those who later read her correspondence detected hints of strain, of loneliness, of a growing melancholy that she struggled to articulate. The isolation was absolute. When the tide covered the causeway, they were trapped on their rocky island with only seabirds for company. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat 50 yards from the tower, a simple two-story structure with 4 rooms, built to withstand hurricanes but offering little comfort. Wind howled through gaps in the walls, salt encrusted the windows, dampness crept into clothing, bedding, bones. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. Margaret helped her mother with household chores and tended to Clara. Tommy explored the tide pools, befriended the gulls, invented games among the rocks. Clara toddled after her siblings, laughing when spray from the waves dampened her dress. But something was changing in Thomas Greer. The first signs were subtle. Eleanor mentioned them in letters to her sister, letters that wouldn't be read carefully until after the tragedy, when people searched desperately for explanations, for warning signs they'd missed. Thomas began spending more time in the lighthouse tower. This wasn't unusual. Keepers often slept in the watchroom during storms or when expecting ship traffic. But Thomas would ascend the 167 iron steps even on calm nights, remaining aloft for hours, staring out at the dark ocean. When Eleanor asked what he was watching for, he'd respond tersely that he was performing his duties, that she couldn't understand the responsibilities he bore. His speech patterns shifted. He'd always been taciturn, a man of few words, but now silence became his default. Days would pass with barely a sentence uttered. When he did speak, his words came out strained, as if forced through some internal resistance. He stopped reading the newspapers that arrived with supply boats. He showed no interest in correspondence from his former revenue cutter service colleagues. He existed in a bubble that contained only the lighthouse, the ocean, and whatever thoughts churned behind his increasingly haunted eyes. Sleep eluded him. Eleanor would wake at 3 in the morning to find his side of the bed empty, cold. She'd look out the window and see him standing on the gallery that encircled the lighthouse top, a silhouette against the revolving beam, motionless for hours. When she confronted him about his insomnia, he claimed the light called to him, that he could hear voices in the fog, that ships were coming that only he could see. The children noticed too. Margaret later told investigators that her father stopped playing with them, stopped responding when they spoke to him, stopped acknowledging their presence except to bark orders or corrections. Tommy said his father's eyes looked empty, that it was like talking to a statue. Even baby Clara seemed to sense something wrong. She'd cry whenever Thomas entered a room, reaching for her mother with desperate insistence. The summer of 1908 brought oppressive heat to the Carolina coast. The Atlantic lay flat and glassy under a merciless sun that baked the rocks and turned the lighthouse cottage into an oven. The Greer's small garden withered despite Eleanor's efforts to water it with precious fresh water hauled from the mainland. Heat shimmered off the rocks in waves, distorting the horizon, making the very air seem hostile. In late July, the supply boat arrived with disturbing news from the mainland. A fisherman from Marsh Haven had gone missing. Samuel Dockery, age 42, an experienced waterman who knew these waters like the lines on his own palms. He'd left port 3 days earlier on a routine fishing run and simply vanished. No wreckage found, no body recovered. Just gone, as if the ocean had opened its maw and swallowed him whole. Thomas Greer heard this news with strange intensity. According to Captain Willis, who commanded the supply vessel, the lighthouse keeper gripped his arm with painful force and demanded every detail. Had Samuel seen anything unusual? Had he reported strange lights on the water? Did he mention voices? The questions made no sense, but Thomas asked them with such fervor that Captain Willis felt genuinely unsettled. Eleanor noticed the shift immediately. After the supply boat departed, Thomas barely slept at all. He paced the gallery constantly, his boots creating an endless rhythmic thud, thud, thud that echoed through the tower. He stopped eating, his clothes hung loose on his frame. His eyes developed a fevered brightness that terrified his wife. On August 3rd, a second fisherman disappeared. Robert Marsh, age 29, vanished between Cormorant Point and Marsh Haven in broad daylight, in calm seas, in his father's sturdy fishing sloop. Search parties found the boat drifting empty 2 miles south of the lighthouse. The sails were properly set. The nets were stowed. Robert's pipe lay on the deck, tobacco still warm in the bowl, but Robert himself was gone. The community of Marsh Haven fell into panic. 2 experienced watermen lost in the space of 3 weeks, both in the vicinity of Cormorant Point. Superstition ran deep among fishing folk. These were people who crossed themselves before leaving port, who threw salt over their shoulders, who believed in omens and sea witches and restless dead. Now wild theories spread through the waterfront taverns. Some claimed a monster lurked in the deep water off the point, perhaps disturbed by recent coastal storms. Others whispered about curses, about the lighthouse being built on ground sacred to the indigenous people who'd lived on these shores centuries before colonization. A few brave souls suggested investigating the lighthouse itself. This proposal met resistance. Thomas Greer was a federal employee, a respected keeper with an exemplary record. Accusing him of anything seemed absurd, but the disappearances continued. On August 12th, a third man vanished. Jonathan Pitt, age 56, a grandfather and deacon at the Methodist Church. His skiff was found capsized on the rocks directly below the lighthouse, its hull intact. No explanation for why an experienced boatman would capsize in calm conditions within sight of shore. That's when Sheriff Coleman Hayes got involved. Hayes was 48 years old, a former Confederate soldier who'd served in his teens during the war's final years. He'd been sheriff of coastal Carolina County for 20 years, a no-nonsense lawman respected for his fairness and persistence. He didn't believe in sea monsters or curses. He believed in evidence, in logic, in methodical investigation. On August 15th, Sheriff Hayes made the crossing to Cormorant Point at low tide, riding his horse along the exposed causeway. With him came his deputy, Frank Morrison, and Dr. Alexander Webb, the county physician. They intended to interview Thomas Greer, to determine if the lighthouse keeper had witnessed anything that might explain the disappearances. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The official report, filed with the Coast Guard on August 16, 1908, provides a chilling account of what Sheriff Hayes discovered. They arrived at the lighthouse at 10 in the morning. The tide had receded, leaving the causeway exposed and passable. The August sun blazed overhead, turning the rocks into griddles that radiated heat in shimmering waves. Everything appeared normal from a distance. The lighthouse stood tall and white against the blue sky, its lens gleaming, seabirds wheeling overhead in their eternal patrol. But as they approached the keeper's cottage, an oppressive silence greeted them. No children's laughter, no domestic sounds of life and activity, just the constant crash of waves and the crying of gulls. Sheriff Hayes knocked on the cottage door. No response. He knocked again, harder, calling out Thomas Greer's name. Still nothing. He tried the handle and found it unlocked unusual, as lighthouse keepers typically secured their homes against the elements and occasional unwanted visitors. The door swung open on squealing hinges. The smell hit them first, not the expected sense of salt and damp, but something else. Something wrong, something that made Deputy Morrison gag and step backward, hand flying to his face. The cottage interior was dim, all curtains drawn despite the bright day outside. As their eyes adjusted, they saw the main room was in disarray. Furniture overturned, dishes smashed, what looked like claw marks gouged into the wooden walls. A child's doll lay face down in the corner, one arm torn off. Papers scattered everywhere, covered in frantic handwriting that spiraled across the pages in tightening circles. Greer, Sheriff Hayes called out, "Thomas Greer, this is the sheriff. I need to speak with you." No answer. Just the house's oppressive silence, broken only by the buzzing of flies. They moved deeper into the cottage, weapons drawn now, every sense screaming warnings. Dr. Webb later wrote that he'd felt a presence of malevolence in that house, as if the walls themselves had absorbed some poison and now radiated it back. The kitchen was worse. Blood, not much, but enough. Dark stains on the floorboards, smeared across the table, handprints on the door leading to the bedroom. Deputy Morrison made the sign of the cross, his hands shaking. Sheriff Hayes pushed open the bedroom door. Empty, beds stripped, closet doors hanging open, but more blood here, soaked into the mattress, pooled in depressions in the floor. Signs of struggle, signs of violence, and the overwhelming certainty that something terrible had happened within these walls. "Search the grounds," Hayes ordered. "Check everywhere, the tower, the outbuildings, the rocks." Now, they found Eleanor first. Her body lay wedged between two large boulders at the base of the cliff, 50 yards south of the lighthouse. The tide had been washing over her for hours, maybe days, the ocean trying to claim what had been left on its doorstep. She wore a white nightgown, now stained with blood and seawater, torn in multiple places. Her dark hair spread around her head like seaweed. Dr. Webb climbed down to examine her while the sheriff and deputy watched from above, both men's faces gray with horror. The physician worked in grim silence, his hands gentle despite the urgency. When he finally looked up, his expression told them everything they needed to know. "Dead," he called up, multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. She's been here at least 24 hours, possibly longer. The children they discovered in the water. Margaret and Tommy were floating in a tide pool on the lighthouse's north side, their small bodies caught in a crevice where the ocean had deposited them like driftwood. They were fully clothed, dressed for bed in their nightshirts. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, as if they'd simply fallen asleep. But the bruises around their necks told a different story. Dr. Webb examined them on the rocks where Deputy Morrison had carefully laid them out, treating the dead children with infinite tenderness despite the circumstances. Both had been strangled, the physician determined. Both had water in their lungs, suggesting they'd still been alive barely when they entered the ocean. Baby Clara remained missing. They searched for hours, combing every inch of the rocky shore, every tide pool, every crevice. The ocean had taken her, had swallowed her completely, offering nothing back, and Thomas Greer was nowhere to be found. The lighthouse tower beckoned. Sheriff Hayes climbed the iron stairs alone, his boots ringing on the metal steps, the sound echoing in the cylindrical chamber. 160, 7 steps spiraling upward, around and around, higher and higher, until his legs burned and his breath came in gasps. Up through the watchroom with its charts and logs. Up through the lens room where the great Fresnel lens sat dormant in the daylight, its prismatic crystals catching the sun and throwing rainbows across the walls. Up to the gallery. Thomas Greer sat on the narrow walkway that encircled the lighthouse top, his back against the tower's white exterior, his legs dangling over the edge. 120 feet of empty air separated him from the rocks below. He didn't turn when the sheriff emerged onto the gallery. He simply sat there, staring out at the endless Atlantic, wind whipping his hair, gulls screaming overhead. Thomas Greer, Sheriff Hayes said carefully, one hand on his revolver, "I need you to stand up slowly and come with me." The lighthouse keeper turned his head. His face was gaunt, skeletal, his eyes sunken into dark hollows. Blood stained his clothes, his shirt, his trousers, his hands. 3 days' worth of beard growth shadowed his jaw. He looked like a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. They wouldn't stop crying, Thomas said. His voice was barely audible over the wind. Day and night, crying, demanding, needing, "Do you understand? The light requires silence. The vigil requires peace." But they wouldn't stop. "Where's the baby?" Hayes asked. "Where's Clara?" Thomas smiled. It was the most horrible expression the sheriff had ever seen on a human face, joyless, empty, utterly devoid of humanity. "I gave her to the ocean," he said, "a sacrifice, for safe passage, for the ships, for the light." He stood up then, balanced on the narrow gallery railing, wind catching his clothes. "The ocean speaks to me," Thomas continued. "It has been speaking for months, telling me what must be done, showing me the truth. We are nothing, specks, meaningless organisms clinging to rock while the vast deep churns beneath us, ancient and hungry and patient." Thomas, step down, come away from the edge. "I've been the light," Thomas said. "I've kept the darkness at bay, but the darkness is everywhere, Sheriff, in the water, in the fog, in my wife's eyes, in my children's laughter. I had to stop it. I had to make it quiet so I could hear the ocean's voice clearly." He looked down at the rocks far below, where his wife's body had been removed, where his children's small corpses had been found. "They should thank me," he said. "I freed them from need, from desire, from the terrible burden of consciousness." And then he stepped backward into empty air. Thomas Greer's body struck the rocks with an impact that echoed across the point like a gunshot. Deputy Morrison, still searching the shore below, watched in horror as the lighthouse keeper fell, arms spread wide, almost peaceful, as if he were diving into water rather than plummeting to his death. The investigation that followed pieced together the final days of the Greer family through scattered evidence, Eleanor's letters, Thomas's increasingly deranged logbook entries, testimony from Captain Willis and other supply boat operators who'd noticed the keeper's deteriorating mental state. The last coherent entry in Thomas's log was dated August 10th. The fog came again tonight. In the fog, I hear them, the drowned, the lost. They call to me from the deep places. They want company. They want to pull the living down to join them in the cold dark where pressure crushes thought and salt water fills the lungs. Eleanor doesn't understand. The children don't understand. They think this is a lighthouse. They don't realize this is a prison, a watchtower, a battle station in a war against the endless hungry dark. After that, the entries devolved into incomprehensible scrawls and symbols, spirals and waves drawn over and over until the pages were black with ink. Based on evidence, Dr. Webb and Sheriff Hayes reconstructed the timeline of murders. On the night of August 12th, Thomas had killed his wife first, stabbing her multiple times in their bedroom before dragging her body outside and throwing her from the cliff. The children, awakened by their mother's screams, had hidden. Thomas had found them in the storage room beneath the cottage. He'd strangled Margaret and Tommy, then carried their limp bodies to the water's edge and laid them in the tide pool, allowing the ocean to finish what he'd started. Baby Clara's death remained uncertain. Most likely, Thomas had simply thrown her from the rocks, a tiny bundle in her sleeping gown, too small to survive the fall and the waves that followed. The Cormorant Point Lighthouse closed permanently on September 1, 1908. The Coast Guard deemed the station compromised and ordered the light extinguished, the lens removed, the buildings sealed. Within 2 years, a new lighthouse was constructed 12 miles south, equipped with the latest technology and staffed by rotating crews who never stayed longer than a month at a time. The bodies of Eleanor, Margaret, and Tommy Greer were transported back to Boston for burial in the family plot. Clara's body was never recovered, though fishermen reported finding an infant's nightgown washed up on the beach 3 weeks after the tragedy, torn and stained with salt water and blood. Thomas Greer's remains were buried in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field outside Marsh Haven. The local Methodist minister refused to conduct services, declaring the lighthouse keeper's soul beyond redemption, consigned to whatever judgment awaits those who slay innocents. To this day, no marker identifies the plot, though locals know its location and give it wide berth. The 3 missing fishermen were never found. No evidence ever emerged connecting Thomas Greer to their disappearances, though many in Marsh Haven remained convinced that the lighthouse keeper had killed them too, had somehow lured them to the rocks and murdered them during his descent into madness. Sheriff Hayes investigated thoroughly but found no proof. The disappearances remained unsolved, attributed officially to maritime accidents, but whispered about in taverns as something more sinister. The Cormorant Point Lighthouse still stands today, over a century later. The building has decayed significantly, windows broken, walls crumbling, vegetation reclaiming the grounds. The causeway washed away decades ago, making the lighthouse accessible only by boat during low tide. It's officially off limits, posted with warning signs and chain link fencing, but trespassers still visit. Urban explorers, ghost hunters, morbidly curious tourists. They climb the rusted stairs to the gallery where Thomas Greer sat before his final plunge. They explore the keeper's cottage, its floors littered with debris and the nests of seabirds. They photograph the water, stained walls, the overturned furniture, the child's doll still lying in the corner after all these years, likely placed there by previous visitors recreating the scene, but effective none the less at evoking the horror that unfolded within those walls, What drove Thomas Greer to murder his family? The question haunted investigators then and intrigues researchers now. Dr. Webb concluded in his official report that the lighthouse keeper suffered from what was then called melancholia, or brain fever, what modern psychiatry would likely diagnose as a severe psychotic break, possibly schizophrenia with paranoid and auditory hallucinations. The isolation, the monotony, the constant responsibility, the lack of sleep. All these factors could have contributed to mental deterioration. But some who knew Thomas Greer believed something more fundamental broke inside him. His brother, Edward, who traveled from Massachusetts after the tragedy, told reporters that Thomas had always possessed a darkness of spirit, a tendency toward obsession and rigid thinking that military discipline had kept in check. Remove that structure, Edward suggested, isolate him on a rock with only the endless ocean for company, and those latent tendencies flourished into something monstrous. Eleanor's sister, Catherine, blamed the lighthouse service itself. How could any sane person endure such isolation? How could any family thrive in such conditions? The lighthouse, she argued in an impassioned letter to federal authorities, was inherently a place of madness, and putting families, there was criminal negligence. The Coast Guard responded by implementing new policies, psychological evaluations for lighthouse keepers, mandatory leave requirements, more frequent inspections, shorter duty rotations at isolated stations. Whether these changes prevented future tragedies remains uncertain, but at least the bureaucracy acknowledged that something had gone terribly wrong at Cormorant Point. Modern psychologists examining the case have suggested additional factors. Postpartum depression in Eleanor that Thomas couldn't cope with, vitamin deficiency from poor diet, lead poisoning from the lighthouse's water supply, carbon monoxide exposure from the lamp mechanism. All plausible, all possible, but none quite explaining the totality of Thomas Greer's transformation from exemplary keeper to family annihilator. Perhaps that's the most disturbing aspect of this tragedy. There's no simple explanation, no single cause, no monster we can point to and say, that's what went wrong. Instead, we're left with the unsettling reality that an ordinary man, disciplined, competent, respected, could, under the right circumstances, become capable of unthinkable evil. The story of Thomas Greer and the Cormorant Point tragedy has entered local folklore, acquiring layers of embellishment and supernatural addition over the decades. Some claim the lighthouse is haunted. Fishermen report seeing lights in the tower at night, despite the lens having been removed in 1909. They describe a figure on the gallery, a man standing motionless, watching the ocean, always watching. When they approach to investigate, the figure vanishes, leaving only the wind and the crying of gulls. Others report hearing voices when passing Cormorant Point in the fog. A woman screaming, children crying, a man's voice raised in rage or perhaps madness. One commercial fisherman, interviewed in 1973, claimed he'd heard what sounded like a baby crying from the rocks, though no infant could possibly survive in that environment. When he investigated, he found nothing but seaweed and empty tide pools. The legend has grown that the Greer family's ghosts remained trapped at the lighthouse, bound to the place where they died, unable to find peace or move beyond the horror of their final moments. Psychic investigators have visited multiple times over the years, claiming to detect strong presences and residual energy. Ghost hunting television shows have filmed episodes there, capturing mysterious sounds and supposed apparitions that skeptics dismiss as wind, wildlife, and overactive imaginations. Whether or not supernatural elements exist at Cormorant Point, the psychological haunting is undeniable. The tragedy cast a long shadow over coastal Carolina County. Families stopped applying for lighthouse positions. The romance of maritime service soured into something darker. People looked at lighthouses differently after 1908, not as symbols of safety and guidance, but as potential prisons where isolation could breed monstrosity. In researching this story, certain patterns emerge that connect to broader historical themes. The early 20th century marked a transition period in American life, rural communities giving way to urbanization, traditional occupations becoming obsolete, the pace of change accelerating in ways that left many people disoriented and struggling to adapt. Lighthouse keeping represented the old world. It required skills and temperaments that modernity was rapidly rendering unnecessary. Within 3 decades of the Cormorant Point tragedy, automation would eliminate most lighthouse keeper positions entirely. The men who devoted their lives to this work found themselves displaced, their expertise no longer needed, their identity undermined. Perhaps Thomas Greer sensed this obsolescence. Perhaps his growing madness reflected not just personal, psychological breakdown, but a broader cultural anxiety about relevance and purpose in a changing world. His insistence that the light requires silence could be interpreted as desperate clinging to order and meaning in the face of chaos. The chaos of modernity, of family demands, of human need and weakness that interfered with his idealized vision of perfect duty and discipline. This doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing excuses the murder of innocence. But it contextualizes the tragedy within larger patterns of societal stress and individual breakdown that occurred across America during this period. Thomas Greer wasn't unique. Other family annihilators existed in this era. Farmers who killed their wives and children before taking their own lives as their land failed. Factory workers who snapped under industrial pressure. Professionals who couldn't cope with financial ruin. What makes the Cormorant Point case particularly haunting is its setting. The lighthouse, that symbol of safety, of guidance, of hope in the darkness, became instead a site of horror. The man tasked with protecting lives became their destroyer. The light that should have warned sailors away from danger couldn't illuminate the darkness in Thomas Greer's own mind. The story of Thomas Greer remains a disturbing reminder that the line between sanity and madness, between protector and predator, can be frighteningly thin. It speaks to the dangers of isolation, the importance of mental health awareness, the need for support systems and intervention when people show signs of psychological distress. But questions remain. What exactly did Thomas hear in the fog? Were the fishermen's disappearances truly accidents? Or did the lighthouse keeper claim more victims than we know? Did Eleanor suspect what was coming? Did she try to flee, but find herself trapped by tide and distance? Could anyone have prevented this tragedy if they'd recognized the warning signs earlier? To this day, the Cormorant Point Lighthouse stands as a monument to this horror. The structure is crumbling, succumbing to decades of salt spray and neglect, but it endures, like the memory of what happened there. Like the questions that refuse to die. And on silent nights, when fog rolls in from the Atlantic and obscures the boundary between land and sea, fishermen still give Cormorant Point a wide berth. They claim the rocks are treacherous, the currents unpredictable. But some admit to deeper fears that something lingers there, some echo of the tragedy, some residue of the madness that consumed a family on a summer night in 1908. If this journey through one of maritime history's darkest chapters resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the fragility of the human mind and the terrible things ordinary people become capable of under extreme circumstances, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on what drives good people to commit terrible acts. Until next time, remember that darkness exists not just in the world around us, but sometimes in places we never think to look. In the hearts of those we trust, in the minds of those sworn to protect, in the silence between lighthouse beam rotations when the dark comes rushing back.